The world is quiet when you stop listening for answers, not silent in the way of emptiness, but quiet like a shoreline at night, when the tide has already withdrawn and left only a thin, reflective skin of water across the sand. In that stillness, the mind loosens its grip on urgency. Thoughts, slow time stretches, and something older than memory begins to surface, not as a fact, not as a story, but as a feeling that settles gently behind the eyes. There are places on earth where the land feels tired, not broken, not ruined, but worn smooth as if it has been handled too many times by forces that did not intend harm. Valleys without scars, plains without bones, coastlines where nothing dramatic seems to have happened, and yet everything feels as though it has already passed. It is easy to believe that history is loud, that endings arrive with fire, collapse, and noise that echoes through generations. But what if some endings never announce themselves at all? What if they arrive the way evening does, slowly dimming the edges of the world, until no one noticed the moment the light finally changed? Long before the great flood that survives in so many traditions, long before the waters that were named and remembered, there may have been other floods, not singular events, not divine punishments, not catastrophes worth carving into stone. Just water doing what water has always done, rising patiently, receding without ceremony, carrying away the fragile arrangements of human life, the way breath carries warmth into cold air and then releases it. Not cities of towering stone or monuments meant to endure, but quieter worlds, worlds of wood, reed, clay fiber, and memory, worlds built with the understanding that nothing truly stays, worlds that expected the land to change, the rivers to wander, the sea to return what it had once borrowed. In such worlds, survival would not have meant resisting water, but yielding to it. Homes might have been temporary by design, settlements light enough to be lifted, dismantled, or abandoned without grief. Knowledge carried in stories and hands rather than walls. Lives shaped around movement instead of permanence. If floods like these came, they would not have shattered civilizations overnight. They would have thinned them. Families would have moved inland, upstream, or simply away. Traditions would have softened. Names would have faded. Children would have grown up hearing fragments of older places that no longer existed. Not because they were destroyed, but because they were no longer needed. Over generations, memory would blur, like ink in water, spreading until it could no longer be read, only sensed. This is the kind of ending archaeology struggles to see. Soil remembers collapse, stone remembers fire, but gentleness leaves little trace. A slow flood rearranges sediments without drama. It smooths instead of breaks. It buries without crushing. What remains is absence that feels intentional, as if the world itself agreed to let something go across continents. There are regions where human presence seems to restart rather than continue, where tools appear without clear ancestors, where settlements rise on land that shows no sign of prior occupation, even though the climate and resources suggest people should have lived there long before. These gaps are often explained as ignorance, as missing data, as time erasing evidence. But what if time did not erase it violently? What if it simply washed it thin? If earlier floods moved slowly, season after season, year after year, they would not leave behind drowned cities. They would leave behind stories of relocation, stories of elders who said the water used to come closer, stories of pasts that no longer exist, stories told without fear because the change was gradual enough to adapt to. In such a world, there would be no reason to mark the flood as an ending. It would feel more like a transition, a background condition of life rather than a defining event. Only much later, when a more sudden flood arrived, would people look back and realize that water could also arrive loudly. And when that louder flood came, when it rose faster than memory could adjust, it would stand out sharply against a long history of softer endings. It would demand a story. It would require explanation. It would become the Great Flood. But beneath that remembered catastrophe would lie layers of quieter erasures, unrecorded not because they were insignificant but because they were survivable. Imagine a coastline slowly retreating over centuries, camps shift inland, fishing grounds change, ritual, adapt. Ancestors are not buried beneath waves in a single moment, but left behind gradually as the sea claims ground that was once familiar. No one runs, no one screams. Life simply rearranges itself again and again, until the old place exists only as a direction, not a destination. Children born into the new land hear of the old shore, the way we hear of childhood homes we never saw. Vaguely, tenderly, without urgency. Over time, even those stories thin, not because they are forbidden, but because they no longer anchor daily life. Memory becomes symbolic, the flood becomes metaphor, water becomes a teacher rather than an enemy. If this happened repeatedly across millennia, humanity would carry an inherited end violently. That adaptation is more common than collapse. That disappearance does not require destruction. And perhaps this is why so many ancient traditions speak of cycles rather than finales. Why time is imagined as turning, returning, softening its own edges. A woe shaped not by a single apocalypse, but by many gentle departures. The land itself seems to support this possibility. Vast sediment layers laid down calmly, without signs of chaos. Ancient shorelines smoothed into hills, river deltas expanded and retreated so many times that they no longer remember their own outlines. In these places, the earth does not look wounded, it looks rearranged. If earlier human worlds existed within these shifting environments, their traces would not be preserved as ruins. They would be scattered as patterns. Subtle changes in soil chemistry, slight anomalies in pollen. A stone tool carried far from its source by water and found generations later with no context. To later observers, it would seem as though humanity appeared suddenly, fully formed, after long stretches of emptiness. But that emptiness would be an illusion. What if the earliest human civilizations were not primitive because they lacked skill, but because they lacked permanence by choice? Because they did not believe the world was something to be conquered and fixed, but something to be listened to and followed. In such cultures, memory would be fluid. History would not be linear. Knowledge would be carried forward only as long as it remained useful. When conditions changed, knowledge would change with them. There would be no anxiety about loss, because loss would be expected. Floods in this context would not be punishments, they would be signals, slow instructions written in water rather than words. Move here, not there. Now is not the time. Wait, adapt. Only when humanity began to build in ways that resisted movement, anchoring itself to specific places with stone and hierarchy, would floods become enemies. Only then would water feel like an intruder rather than a companion. And when that shift occurred, when permanence replaced flexibility, the next flood would not be gentle. It would be remembered. It would be mourned. It would be named. The Great Flood may not have been humanity's first encounter with rising water, but it may have been the first time humanity refused to move with it. If so, the flood myths that survive are not memories of the beginning of loss, but of the end of softness. They remember a moment when adaptation failed, when memory could no longer thin itself safely, when the world demanded movement and humanity hesitated. That hesitation would harden into tragedy, and tragedy into story. But beneath those stories, like a current beneath the surface, there may be older memories that never crystallized into myth, lives that shifted rather than broke, civilizations that dissolved quietly into their descendants. These memories would not survive as dates or names. They would survive as instincts, as a sense that the ground is temporary, that water is patient, that nothing truly disappears. It only spreads. Perhaps this is why, even now, there is a strange calm in places where nothing seems to have happened. A feeling that the land has already lived many lives, and does not need to prove it. A sense that absence itself can be a form of evidence, if one knows how to listen. As you let this thought settle, imagine those earlier worlds, not as lost, but as completed. Not erased, but finished gently, like a sentence that does not require punctuation to be understood. They did not leave ruins because they did not believe in staying behind. They trusted that what mattered would travel forward, carried in people rather than places, in habits rather than monuments, in the quiet knowledge of when to move on. And somewhere deep in human memory, beneath the noise of history, that trust may still remain, waiting patiently, like water at the edge of the land, for the moment when the world asks us to listen again. That quiet knowledge does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a warning or a prophecy. It is felt instead as a subtle unease when permanence is overstated, when walls grow too thick, when structures begin to speak more about fear than belonging. It is the feeling that nothing meant to last forever ever truly does, and that insisting otherwise invites tension between human intention and the slower patience of the earth. In the imagined worlds before remembered history, this tension may have been rare. People would have lived close enough to the rhythms of land and water to sense gradual change long before it demanded response. A river shifting its course by the width of a foot in a lifetime would be noted. A shoreline creeping inward year after year would be accepted. Movement would not feel like loss but like participation. When floods came, they would not arrive as singular events. They would come as seasons growing longer, as rains that lingered, as wetlands expanding where fields once dried. Each small change would offer time. Time to adjust, to gather, to relocate, without panic. The world would not need to be escaped, only followed. If this pattern repeated across generations, humanity would develop a relationship with water that was neither reverent nor hostile, but familiar. Water would be understood as something that rearranges life, not something that ends it. Stories told around fires would not speak of punishment, but of listening closely, of knowing when to leave, of remembering pasts that are no longer there. These stories would not need preservation through writing or stone. They would live in gestures, in seasonal movements, in the unspoken understanding of where not to build and when not to return. Knowledge would be embodied rather than recorded. Such worlds would leave little behind because they would carry themselves forward. When we imagine ancient civilizations, we often picture accumulation, more tools, more complexity, more permanence. But it is possible that some of the earliest human worlds measured success differently, not by how long structures endured, but by how gracefully lives adapted in these worlds. Innovation would not aim toward dominance over nature, but harmony with change. Materials chosen for building would weather easily. Tools would be simple enough to remake anywhere. Art would be portable, woven into clothing, skin. Identity would not be tied to place alone, but to movement between places. A slow flood in such a culture would not erase identity. It would test it. And if identity could move, it would survive. Over centuries, however, even adaptable cultures might change. Population growth could make movement more difficult. Certain places might become central to trade, memory, or ritual. Gradually, attachment could deepen, srin could become heavier, boundaries more defined. The softness that once allowed erasure without trauma could begin to stiffen. This shift would not happen suddenly. It would unfold quietly, as most transformations do. A shrine rebuilt instead of relocated. A wall reinforced rather than dismantled. Each choice reasonable in isolation, yet together forming a pattern of resistance to change. In such a moment, water would still rise patiently. It would not hurry to meet human decisions. It would wait. When floods came during this transitional era, their impact would differ from those before. They would still be slow, but their consequences would feel heavier. Loss would be felt more sharply because attachment had deepened. Memory would cling rather than flow. Stories would begin to solidify around these moments, not because the floods were more violent, but because people were less willing to let go. Perhaps the earliest flood stories were not accounts of sudden destruction, but reflections on moments when adaptation became painful, when moving meant abandoning something cherished rather than expected. When the old softness was recognized only in its absence, as these stories were told and retold, details would compress, time would shorten. Generations of gradual change might be remembered as a single event. A long, quiet departure might become a flood that came once, rather than always. Language itself encourages this compression. It prefers beginnings and endings. It struggles with continuity. And so memory, shaped by language, turns slow dissolutions into moments. By the time the Great Flood emerges in human storytelling, it may already represent an accumulation of many waters, many movements, many soft erasures condensed into one defining narrative, a way to speak about loss that feels manageable because it has edges. But beneath that story, beneath the drama and symbolism, the older experience of gradual change would still linger. It would be felt rather than remembered. Passed on, not as history but as temperament. A caution against overbuilding. A preference for flexibility. A subtle unease with claims of permanence. These inherited instincts may surface even today, to move, to let go of excess without fully understanding why. They may appear as restlessness, as nostalgia for places never visited, as a sense that the world is not meant to be held tightly in landscapes shaped by repeated gentle flooding. This feeling can be especially strong. Wetlands, Deltas, river plains, and coasts often carry a sense of impermanence that feels ancient. They are neither land nor water, but something in between. Living in such places teaches patience, adaptability, and respect for cycles. If early human worlds flourished in these environments, their disappearance would not leave dramatic ruins. It would leave layered soils, overlapping ecosystem. Later civilizations seeking origins would look at these places and see emptiness. They would not recognize that absence as a legacy. They would assume nothing had been there, but emptiness can be crude, silence can be intentional. The idea that entire worlds could fade without leaving ruins challenges modern assumptions about progress and importance. It suggests that significance does not require endurance, that a life, a culture, or a way of being can matter deeply without insisting on permanence. This idea is unsettling because it offers no monument to admire, no proof to display. It asks us to value what cannot be excavated, and yet there is a strange comfort in it, a sense that loss does not always need to be violent to be meaningful, that endings can be integrated into continuity rather than standing apart from it. If floods before the Great Flood erased worlds softly, then humanity's story is not one of repeated collapse, but of repeated adaptation. Not a series of failures, but a long conversation with change. The Earth, in this view, is not an adversary testing resilience through catastrophe, but a partner offering lessons slowly enough to be learned. Water rises. People move. Memory thins. Life continues. Only when this rhythm is interrupted. When movement is resisted, does water become destructive. Only when memory insists on solidity does erasure feel like tragedy. Perhaps the Great Flood stands out, not because it was unique devastating, but because it marked the moment when humanity stopped listening quietly. After that moment, stories would shift. Floods would become warnings rather than instructions. Water would be framed as punishment rather than guidance. The softness that once allowed worlds to end without fear would be replaced by anxiety about loss. And so the older, gentler floods would slip beneath the surface of memory, no longer named, no longer distinguished, absorbed into a sense of deep time that feels inaccessible. But deep time does not forget. It holds everything differently. The land remembers not through ruins, but through shape, through slope and grain and flow, through the way rivers still seek old paths, even after thousands of years, through coastlines that curve as if recalling where they once rested. If one listens closely enough, these shapes tell a story that is not about destruction, but about release. As you imagine those earlier worlds, try not to picture their disappearance as loss. Picture instead a slow exhale, a letting go that allowed something else to form, a continuity that did not require preservation to be real. Those people did not vanish. They changed. They carried forward what mattered, and allowed the rest to dissolve. Their worlds ended softly because they understood that softness is not weakness, but wisdom. And perhaps that understanding still waits within us. Quiet but persistent, reminding us that not every ending needs to be survived loudly to be survived at all. That wisdom, if it survived at all, would not announce itself as knowledge. It would not arrive as a rule or a lesson that could be easily spoken. Instead, it would exist as a tendency, a quiet inclination toward letting go before holding on becomes painful. It would live in the body more than the mind, in the way people sense when a place no longer welcomes them, when staying begins to require force rather than ease in the distant past. This sensing may have been finely tuned. Life close to water teaches attentiveness. The sound of a river changes before it overflows. The smell of wet earth shifts before land becomes saturated. Birds alter their patterns. Plants respond long before human eyes notice anything wrong. Those who lived alongside these rhythms would not need to predict floods. They would feel them approaching as a gradual rearrangement of the world. And so movement would begin early, almost casually. Belongings gathered not in haste, but in familiarity. Paths taken that had been used before, perhaps many times in previous generations. There would be no panic because there would be no surprise. The flood would not be an interruption of life, but part of its ongoing shape. If such movements happen repeatedly over thousands of years, entire regions could host human presence without ever accumulating what later ages would recognize as ruins. Campsites, reused and abandoned. Villages, assembled. Then Banton, Saces, honor. Saces, honored. 4. The land would absorb these traces easily, folding them into its own cycles. To a future observer, it would appear as though nothing had been there at all. This absence challenges a deeply ingrained assumption that what matters must leave a mark, that significance is measured by endurance, that to be real something must resist time. Yet nature itself operates differently. Rivers matter without staying still. Forests matter. Shorelines matter even as they move. If early human worlds aligned themselves with this understanding, their disappearance would not signal failure, it would signal completion. Perhaps this is why the earliest flood memories feel so different from later ones. They are often vague, symbolic, lacking detail. Water appears not as an enemy, but as a presence, a boundary between ages rather than a weapon, a medium through which one world becomes another. These stories may not describe a single event at all, but a pattern, a rhythm of approach and retreat, repeated until it shaped how people understood time itself. The past would not be something sealed off by catastrophe, but something that gently receded, still accessible through memory and imagination. As societies grew more complex, however, this relationship with impermanence may have weakened. Writing, architecture, and hierarchy all favor stability. They reward staying put. They transform memory into record into authority over time. What was once fluid becomes frightening. Movement feels like loss rather than continuity. Water, once familiar, becomes a threat to order. When floods arrive in this context, even slow ones, they feel catastrophic because they undermine the illusion of control. They expose the fragility of systems built on permanence, and so they demand explanation, blame, meaning this is where flood stories begin to change in tone. Water becomes judgment, survival becomes exceptional. Those who endure are chosen rather than simply attentive. Memory narrows around heroes and vessels, and warnings ignored. The Great Flood, in this sense, may not represent a greater volume of water than those that came before. It may represent a greater rupture between humans and change, a moment when adaptation failed not because it was impossible, but because it was no longer culturally acceptable. Before that rupture, worlds could end quietly. After it, endings became traumatic. If this interpretation holds even partially true, then much of human anxiety about loss may be inherited not from catastrophe itself, but from forgetting how to let go, from losing the cultural practices that once made softness possible. The land does not seem to share this anxiety. It reshapes itself continuously without regret. Rivers abandon courses without apology. Seas reclaim ground without malice. The earth does not cling to its previous forms. It transforms them. Human beings, too, carry this capacity, though it often lies dormant beneath layers of expectation and fear. The idea that a world could end without ruins suggests that identity does not need to be anchored in place or structure, that continuity can exist without preservation. This idea can feel unsettling because it removes the comfort of evidence. It asks us to trust in processes rather than artifacts, to accept that meaning does not always fossilize, and yet there are moments when this perspective feels strangely familiar, when standing at the edge of a tidal flat at dusk, when watching fog erase a landscape without harming it, when witnessing seasonal floods that nourish rather than destroy. In these moments, the world seems to whisper that erasure is not always violent. Perhaps early human cultures understood this intuitively. Perhaps they learned to measure success not by what remained behind, but by how smoothly life continued elsewhere, a settlement abandoned without conflict, a tradition carried forward because the context had changed. In this way, floods before the Great Flood would not have erased humanity's past. They would have edited it gently, removing what no longer fit while preserving what could travel. What survives such editing is not architecture, but attitude, not monuments, but ways of relating. These are harder to see but more resilient in the long run. Over time, however, as written history emerged and physical evidence became the primary measure of reality, these softer survivals would be overlooked. Absence would be mistaken for non-existence. Quiet would be mistaken for nothingness. Modern eyes trained to seek ruins would scan landscapes shaped by water and see only nature. They would not recognize the subtle fingerprints of lives lived lightly. They would assume the story began later, with heavier tools and louder traces. This assumption shapes how we imagine our origins. It encourages a narrative of sudden emergence, rather than gradual continuity. A progress from simplicity, It leaves little room for worlds that chose not to remain. Yet when we listen carefully to flood traditions from many cultures, there is often a sense of resignation rather than shock, a tone of inevitability. Water does not surprise. It arrives when it must. Survival is less about conquest than alignment. These tonal qualities may be echoes of much older experiences, residual memory from times when floods were part of an ongoing dialogue with the environment, not an interruption of it. In such a dialogue, the question is never how to stop the water, but how to respond to it, how to move knowledge, relationships, and meaning across changing ground. If worlds before the Great Flood practiced this art of response, then their disappearance would not represent a break in human story, but a continuation expressed differently. Their end would not be marked by silence, but by transformation. This perspective invites a different way of thinking about loss, not as something to be avoided at all costs, but as something that can be navigated with care. It suggests that resilience does not always require resistance. Sometimes it requires release. As you sit with this idea, imagine those ancient people standing at the edge of rising water, not with fear, but with recognition. They have been here before, or their ancestors have. They know what to take and what to leave. They know that the land ahead will also offer life, just arranged differently. They do not look back often, not because they do not care, but because caring does not require holding on. Their attention is forward, attentive to subtle signs, ready to adapt. Their worlds end softly because they understand that endings are not exits, but transitions. If such an understanding once shaped humanity, traces of it may still surface in moments when we feel called to simplify, to relocate, to begin again without dramatic justification. In these moments we may be responding to a memory older than history, a memory of softness. The Great Flood, remembered and named, may stand as a boundary between two ways of relating to change. Before it, water was something to move with. After it, something to fear. But the older way has not vanished entirely. It lingers in quiet places, in gentle landscapes, in stories that resist clarity. It waits in the idea that a world does not need to leave ruins to have been real. And perhaps as the world continues to change, this forgotten wisdom may once again become relevant. Not as a return to the past, but as a reminder that survival does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrives as silence, spreading slowly, leaving space rather than scars, teaching us that softness, too, can carry history forward. And that silence, when it comes, is not empty. It is full of continuity. It carries forward what cannot be fixed in place, what survives only by remaining flexible. In this way, softness becomes a vessel, not for objects, but for ways of being. Consider how memory itself behaves. It does not preserve everything with equal clarity. It blurs edges, releases details, reshapes events to fit the present moment. This is often seen as a flaw, but it may be memory's greatest strength. By softening the past, memory allows it to remain relevant without becoming burdensome. What is too rigid cannot travel. Early human worlds, shaped by gentle floods, may have understood this intuitively. They may have accepted forgetting as part of survival, not forgetting who they were, but forgetting what no longer served the world they were entering. In doing so, they avoided being anchored to conditions that had already passed. This approach to memory would produce cultures that feel elusive to later interpretation. Their stories would lack fixed times. Their symbols would shift in meaning depending on context. Their rituals would evolve rather than repeat exactly to observers accustomed to permanence. This fluidity might look like inconsistent. Floods in such cultures would not erase identity. They would prompt recalibration, a reminder to loosen what had grown too tight, a return to attentiveness. When water rose, it would not demand a reckoning with guilt or blame. It would invite observation. Where does it linger? Where does it recede? What changes first? This kind of attention requires patience. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be commanded. It develops only through long familiarity with place and change. It is a skill honed over generations, passed down not through instruction but through example. A child raised in such a world would not be taught to fear water. They would be taught to watch it, to notice how it speaks without words, to understand that resistance is sometimes appropriate, but alignment is often wiser. If this was once common, It may explain why so many flood stories emphasize survival through listening. Rather than strength, characters are warned, guided, instructed, quietly. They are saved not by power but by timing, not by conquest, but by attention. These stories may preserve fragments of a much older ethic, one that predates monumental architecture and written law, an ethic that values responsiveness over control. As time moved forward and societies became more layered, this ethic would face challenges. Larger nation often requires standardization. Standardization favors fixed rules and stable location. Gradually, the tolerance for fluidity would diminish. Floods would then begin to test not just settlements but systems. They would reveal the limits of rigidity, and when those limits were reached, the experience would feel catastrophic even if the water itself behaved no differently than before. This shift in perception is crucial. It suggests that disaster is not defined solely by natural forces, but by the relationship between those forces and human expectations. When expectations allow for change, disruption feels manageable. When expectations demand stability, the same disruption feels psyche, the sabor, a moment when the balance tipped away from adaptability toward attachment, when the softness that once allowed worlds to fade without trauma was replaced by a need to preserve at all costs. After that point, floods could no longer be absorbed quietly into continuity. They had to be explained, moralized, remembered sharply. Yet even then, traces of the older understanding remained. They appear in the margins of flood myths, in the details that feel almost incidental, the calmness of preparation, the absence of panic, the sense that survival was possible not because of defiance, but because of attentiveness. These details hint at an older memory beneath the narrative surface, a memory of floods that did not erase everything, only rearranged it as centuries passed, and histories layered themselves upon histories. This deeper memory would sink further from conscious awareness. It would no longer be recognized as history, but it would continue to influence for building near water despite the risks, as an intuition that fertile land lies in places shaped by flooding, as a willingness to return to floodplains again and again, even after displacement. Such choices can seem irrational when viewed through the lens of fear, but when seen through the lens of long continuity, they suggest trust. Trust that water, while disruptive, is also sustaining. Trust that life finds ways to adapt if given room. This trust would not eliminate loss. Lives would still be uprooted. Homes would still be left behind. But the meaning of that loss would differ. It would be contextualized as part of a larger pattern, rather than an isolated failure. In worlds accustomed to gentle erasure, grief would exist without despair. Mourning would acknowledge change without freezing it in time. Memory would honor what was, without insisting it remain unchanged. This approach to loss may be one of the most significant inheritances from those early worlds. It offers a way to live with impermanence that does not collapse into anxiety and contrast. When loss is framed as unacceptable, when change is seen as an enemy, grief hardens into fear. Control demands permanence, and permanence, when challenged, produces trauma. The difference lies not in the event, but in the relationship to it. If floods before the Great Flood erased worlds softly, then humanity once practiced a relationship with change that allowed endings to be integrated, rather than resisted. That relationship may feel distant now, but it is not entirely lost. It can still be sensed in the way certain places invite humility. In landscapes where nothing seems to dominate, in environments where human presence feels temporary by design. In these places it becomes easier to imagine living lightly, moving when necessary, leaving without bitterness. Such places often feel peaceful, not because nothing has happened there, but because so much has happened quietly, because the land has learned how to absorb stories without displaying them. Standing in such a place, one might feel a strange familiarity, as if the body recognizes something the mind cannot name. A sense that this way of being, this acceptance of change, is not foreign, but remembered. Perhaps this is the echo of those earlier worlds, not a memory of specific events, but a memory of orientation, a way of facing uncertainty that does not demand resolution. If this is so, then the absence of ruins is not a gap in history but a clue. It suggests that some worlds were never meant to be found as objects. They were meant to be continued as practices. The question then becomes not what was lost, but what was carried forward. What traveled through those gentle floods was not architecture or written law, but adaptability, not monuments, but modes of attention. These are harder to trace, but they endure longer. They appear whenever people respond to change with curiosity rather than panic, whenever movement is seen as opportunity rather than defeat, whenever letting go is recognized as an active choice rather than a failure. In moments like these, the ancient softness briefly re-emerges. As the world continues to shift, as waters rise, and patterns change once again, this forgotten inheritance may quietly resurface, not as nostalgia for a past that cannot be recovered, but as recognition of a capacity that never fully disappeared. The early worlds erased by gentle floods did not vanish into nothingness. They transformed into ways of seeing, ways of responding, ways of living that remain available, if one knows how to listen. Their story is not written in stone because it does not need to be fixed. It moves with the water, patient and attentive, reminding us that history is not only what survives visibly, but what continues invisibly, shaping choices long after its forms have dissolved. And in this understanding, the idea of an ending loses some of its weight. It becomes less a finality and more a passage, less a disappearance and more a redistribution. Worlds do not always collapse. Sometimes they thin, sometimes they spread, sometimes they leave behind, not ruins, but readiness. And perhaps that is the quiet legacy of floods before the Great Flood. Not devastation, but preparation. A long, gentle lesson in how to live within a world that is always becoming something else. That readiness is subtle. It does not feel like anticipation in the modern sense, with plans and projections and certainty about what comes next. It feels more like a loosening of grip, a willingness to be unfinished, a comfort with not knowing exactly where one will settle, only that settling itself is temporary in the deep past. This readiness may have been cultivated slowly, through repeated encounters with change that did not punish attentiveness. Each gentle flood would reaffirm a simple truth, that life continues, but rarely in the same arrangement. That resisting this truth creates friction, while accepting it allows movement to remain fluid. Such an understanding reshapes how time is perceived. Instead of imagining history as a line of accumulation, it becomes a series of overlapping presences. Worlds do not replace one another cleanly, they bleed into each other. Elements of the old persist within the new, altered but recognizable, like a familiar melody played in a different key. This perspective does not deny loss, it reframes it. Loss becomes part of circulation rather than an absolute disappearance. What leaves one place appears elsewhere, what ends in one form continues in another. If floods before the Great Flood erased worlds softly, then those worlds may still exist, not as locations, but as influences, as quiet tendencies in human behavior, as preferences for certain landscape and when to go. They may also exist in the gaps of history, in moments where explanation feels unnecessary, in traditions that resist precise origin stories, in customs that change slightly with each generation, without concern for preservation. These are signs of cultures that prioritize relevance over replication. From this angle, the absence of ruins becomes meaningful. It suggests that not everything needs to be made permanent to be honored, that leaving lightly can be an expression of respect, not neglect. Modern thought often equates preservation with care, but preservation can also become a form of fear, a refusal to allow transformation. The early worlds, shaped by gentle floods, may have understood care differently. Care meant knowing when to release, when to allow the land to do what it has always done. This understanding requires humility. It asks humans to see themselves as participants rather than authors of the world's story, as temporary arrangements within larger processes. This does not diminish human significance, it contextualizes it. When humanity is seen as part of a flowing system rather than its center, change becomes less threatening. The question shifts from how to prevent endings to how to move through them. The Great Flood, remembered so clearly, may mark the moment when this humility faltered, when the desire to endure overtook the willingness to adapt, when water, once a guide, became an adversary. After that moment, stories would increasingly focus on survival against nature rather than survival with it. The tone would harden, the lessons would sharpen, the softness would be remembered only indirectly, as a contrast to loss. Yet softness does not vanish simply because it is no longer named. It persists in the background, shaping responses quietly. It waits for conditions that allow it to surface again. Today, in a world once more confronted with rising waters and shifting patterns, this older inheritance feels less distant. Not as a blueprint to be followed, ships with change have existed. That human history includes not only conquest and collapse, but attentiveness and release. To imagine floods that erased worlds softly is not to romanticize the past. It is to expand the range of what we consider possible, to acknowledge that survival has taken many forms, some of them quiet enough to escape notice. These earlier worlds may never be fully known. They may never be reconstructed or proven in the ways modern inquiry prefers. But their absence invites reflection. It invites us to question assumptions about progress, permanence, and the meaning of legacy. What if legacy is not what remains visible, but what continues to function? Not what stands unchanged, but what adapts gracefully. Not what resists time, but what moves with it. If this is so, then the gentle floods of the distant past were not erasers, but editors. They refined human ways of living by removing what could not travel. They left behind not ruins, but readiness for whatever came next. As the mind settles into this possibility, there is a sense of quiet continuity, a feeling that human story is deeper and softer than the fragments we have preserved, that much has been lived without needing to be remembered explicitly. Perhaps this is why silence can feel meaningful, why the idea of an ending does not always produce fear. Those earlier worlds ended without spectacle. They trusted that what mattered would find its way forward. They allowed themselves to dissolve into the ongoing flow of life, and in doing so they may have left humanity one of its most enduring lessons, that survival does not always require standing firm. Sometimes it requires knowing when to move, when to release, and when to let the water pass through rather than pushing against it. In this lesson, the past does not warn us of destruction. It invites us into relationship. It reminds us that change, when met with attentiveness, does not have to be catastrophic. It can be quiet. It can be soft. Worlds have ended this way before, not with ruins or records, but with continuity carried elsewhere. And perhaps, as we listen closely enough, we can still hear the echo of that softness, moving patiently beneath the surface of history, waiting to be recognized not as loss, but as wisdom.